Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes alive. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. The cafeteria at Oak Ridge High buzzed with the usual lunchtime chaos, but Chris Miller sat alone at the end of a long table, picking at his sandwich while reading a worn book about local folklore. 3 months into the school year, and he was still the outsider, the weird new kid obsessed with ghost stories and urban legends. "Hey, freak show!" Chris flinched at Todd Marshall's voice, but didn't look up. The football captain and his friends had made a sport of tormenting him since his first day. "I'm talking to you, Miller!" Todd dropped into the seat across from him, flanked by his usual crew, Mike, Ryan, and Steve. Their sudden presence drew curious stares from nearby tables. "What's got you so interested today? More made-up monster stories?" Before Chris could react, Ryan snatched the book from his hands. "Legends of Crooked Oaks," he read aloud, snickering. "Seriously? Everyone knows those are just stories to scare little kids." "They're not just stories," Chris said quietly, reaching for his book. "People have gone missing in those woods. My brother." He stopped himself, but it was too late. "Your brother what?" Todd leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Wait, wasn't there something in the paper when you moved here? About your family?" Chris stared at his lunch tray, his throat tight. He had sworn he wouldn't talk about James, wouldn't let anyone here know about that part of his life. But Todd's eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember now. Your brother disappeared in Crooked Oaks, right? That's why your family moved here." Todd's smile turned predatory. "Is that why you're so interested in Crooked Oaks? Think some big bad monster got him?" "Shut up," Chris muttered, his hands clenching into fists under the table. "Hey, I've got an idea," Mike chimed in, grinning. "If Miller's so interested in the forest, maybe we should help him investigate." Todd's eyes gleamed. "Yeah. Hey, Miller, you want to prove you're not just some weird loser? We've got a challenge for you." Chris should have walked away, but something in him, maybe the desperate need to understand what happened to James, maybe just the desire to finally be accepted, made him stay. "What kind of challenge?" "Simple. Spend one night in Crooked Oaks Forest all alone." Todd smirked. "Unless you're scared." "That's crazy," Steve cut in, looking genuinely concerned. "My dad's on the police force. He says people really do disappear in there." "Exactly," Todd exclaimed, "which is why it's perfect. So what do you say, Miller? One night in the woods, and we'll make sure everyone knows you're not just some crazy freak. You might even find a monster." He laughed, but there was a cruel edge to it. Chris looked around at their faces, Todd's challenging smirk, Mike and Ryan's mocking grins, Steve's uneasy frown. He thought about James, about all the nights he'd spent wondering what really happened in those woods. Maybe this was his chance to understand. "When?" The word came out before he could stop it. "This Friday. Spend the night and take pictures to prove you did it." He leaned closer. "But here's the catch. You can't tell anyone where you're going. No parents, no teachers. Just leave a note saying you're sleeping over at my place. Otherwise, everyone will know you chickened out and got an adult to save you." "And if I do it?" Chris asked. "What then?" "Then you're one of us," Todd promised, though his eyes said something different. Simple as that. Chris knew it was stupid, dangerous. His parents would be frantic if they found out. But he was tired of being alone, tired of being the weird kid who lost his brother. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance he'd find some answers in those woods. "Fine," he said. "I'll do it." Todd's grin widened. "Perfect. Oh, and one more thing. You have to camp near the old school bus. You know the one, right? Where all those kids disappeared?" He laughed at Chris's expression. "Better study up on your monster stories, Miller. Looks like you're going to need them." As the group walked away laughing, Chris sat alone with his decision. He pulled out his phone and looked up the forecast for Friday night. Clear skies, full moon. Perfect camping weather. Perfect hunting weather, a small voice in his head whispered. He pushed the thought away and began making a mental list of what he'd need. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. After all, he had learned from James's mistakes. Always be prepared. Always have a plan. What Chris didn't notice was Steve lingering behind his friends, glancing back with worried eyes. The rest of the week crawled by in a blur of sleepless nights and anxious planning. Chris spent hours researching Crooked Oaks Forest, cross-referencing old newspaper articles about disappearances with the legends in his books. He packed and repacked his backpack a dozen times. Flashlights with extra batteries, power banks, his phone, camping gear, first aid supplies, and enough food and water for 24 hours. On Friday night, he left the carefully worded note on the kitchen counter. "Sleeping at Todd's house. Back tomorrow afternoon. Love you." The words felt like ash in his mouth, knowing how his parents would react when they discovered the lie. But as he shouldered his backpack and headed for the forest trail behind the old Thompson farm, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just a dare. Something had been drawing him to these woods since the day his family moved to town. The same inexplicable pull that James had described in his journal before he disappeared. Now, as the autumn sun began its descent toward the horizon, Chris took his first steps onto the narrow dirt path leading into Crooked Oaks Forest. Chris's heart pounded. The dense canopy of ancient oaks blotted out the fading evening light, plunging him into an eerie gloom. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. "Don't be such a baby," he muttered to himself. "It's just some stupid trees." But deep down, Chris knew Crooked Oaks was far more than just trees. The kids at school had said that for generations the townsfolk had whispered about the forest, about the strange lights seen flickering between the gnarled trunks on moonless nights, the unearthly howls that sometimes echoed from its depths, the hikers and campers who had ventured in and never returned. Just like his brother who had vanished in this very forest, part of him wondered if there was a connection, if whatever stalked these woods is what had taken James. Most locals gave Crooked Oaks a wide berth, but not Chris's so-called friends. No, they thought it would be hilarious to dare the new kid in town to spend a night alone in the haunted woods. Chris had wanted so desperately to fit in that he had agreed without hesitation. He hadn't told his parents about the dare. They would never have allowed it, not after James. Instead, he had left a note saying he was sleeping over at Todd's house. It was one of the rules that Todd had laid down anyway. By the time anyone realized he wasn't there, he'd already be deep in the forest. Chris hitched his backpack higher on his shoulders and pressed onward. The path twisted deeper into the forest, roots and rocks threatening to trip him with each step. As night fell in earnest, he flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting weakly through the oppressive darkness. After what felt like hours of walking, Chris finally reached a small clearing. Moonlight filtered through a gap in the canopy, illuminating a grassy space ringed by looming trees. In the center of the clearing sat the rusted hulk of an old school bus, its yellow paint long since faded to a sickly ochre. Nature had begun to reclaim it. Vines crawled up its sides, and small saplings grew through holes in its floor. Chris approached the derelict vehicle cautiously. According to local legend, the bus had been a part of a field trip in the 1970s. The driver had gotten lost in the woods, and when the bus broke down, he had left to seek help. Neither he nor any of the 30 children aboard were ever seen again. All searches had turned up empty until 3 months later, when they found the bus completely empty, with no signs of what had happened to its occupants. With shaking hands, Chris set up his small tent near the bus and unfurled his sleeping bag inside. He didn't dare light a fire. Something told him it would be unwise to draw attention to himself out there. Instead, he munched on some granola bars and took swigs from his water bottle, straining his ears for any unusual sounds. The forest was unnaturally still. No owls hooted, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. The silence pressed in on Chris, smothering as a thick blanket. He shivered, zipping his jacket up to his chin. "Get it together," he told himself sternly. "Nothing's going to happen. In the morning you can go home and tell those jerks you did it. They'll have to accept you then." As he sat there, Chris noticed something odd about the bus. Despite decades of exposure to the elements, there were no signs of animal nests or droppings inside. It was as if even the forest creatures knew to avoid it. Curiosity overcame his fear, and he approached the vehicle, shining his flashlight through the grimy windows. The beam caught something that made his blood run cold. Fresh scratches in the metal, not rusted like the rest of the bus. Some looked only days old. And on the floor, partially obscured by leaves, lay a weathered notebook. Chris's hands trembled as he realized it was identical to the journal his brother had always carried. Before he could investigate further, a blood-curdling shriek pierced the night. Heart racing, Chris dropped the notebook and spun around, fumbling with his flashlight. The beam danced wildly around the clearing as his hands shook. "Hello?" he called out, hating how small and frightened his voice sounded. "Is someone there?" Silence, then a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from every direction at once. Chris's breath caught in his throat. That was no ordinary animal sound. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. In the wavering beam of his flashlight, movement caught his eye. Something pale and elongated slipping between the trees, too fast to track. "This is stupid," Steve muttered, ducking under a low-hanging branch as he followed Todd, Mike, and Ryan deeper into Crooked Oaks. The sun had set an hour ago, and their flashlight beams carved weak paths through the darkness. "We've made our point. Let's just go back." "Don't be such a baby," Todd snapped, checking his phone's GPS. "Miller's been at the bus for almost 2 hours now, probably crying his eyes out already." He patted his backpack, which clinked with the bottles of cheap beer they brought along. "This is gonna be epic." Mike grinned, adjusting the werewolf mask in his hands. "Can't wait to see his face when we jump out at him. Think he'll wet himself?" "I still think this is messed up," Steve said, falling behind slightly. "You saw those articles he was reading. People really do vanish out here." "That's what makes it perfect," Ryan laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Miller's already scared of monsters. By the time we're done, he'll—" A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind them. All 4 boys froze. "What was that?" Mike whispered, the mask dropping from his suddenly trembling hands. Todd played his flashlight beam through the trees, trying to appear confident despite his rapid breathing. "Probably just a deer or something. Come on, we're almost—" The scream that cut through the night was like nothing any of them had ever heard. A horrible blend of animal rage and human agony. "Run!" Steve yelled, but it was too late. Something pale and elongated burst from the shadows, moving impossibly fast. Ryan went down first. yanked backwards into the darkness with a choked cry. Mike's scream was cut short as quickly curved claws raked across his chest. Todd turned to flee, but tripped over one of the beer bottles that had spilled from his pack. Steve stood paralyzed with horror as the creature emerged into full view. Its emaciated form towered over Todd. Skull-like face split in a nightmarish grin full of needle-sharp teeth. But its eyes looked almost human as they studied its prey. "Please," Todd whimpered, scrambling backward. "Please, we were just..." The creature's head snapped toward Steve, who had begun inching away. When it spoke, the sound made his blood run cold. It was Todd's voice, perfectly mimicked. "Don't be such a baby." Steve ran. Behind him, Todd's screams echoed through the forest, quickly joined by sounds of ripping and tearing. Steve ran until his lungs burned, until he crashed through a clearing and saw the old school bus looming in the moonlight. Chris should be in there. "Chris!" he shouted, racing toward the bus. "Chris, run! It's coming! It's..." Movement caught his eye. For a split second, Steve saw Chris's pale face in one of the bus windows, eyes wide with fear. Then something grabbed Steve from behind, dragging him back toward the trees. His final scream died in his throat as the creature's claws tightened around his neck. Inside the bus, Chris huddled in the shadows, hands pressed over his mouth to stifle his breathing. He had recognized Steve's voice, his real voice, not the creature's mimicry. But he also knew the monster was out there hunting. To move now would mean death. So he stayed hidden, tears streaming down his face as he listened to the sounds of his tormentors dying in the darkness. Hours later, when he found their scattered belongings, Todd's broken phone, Mike's werewolf mask torn to shreds, Steve's Letterman jacket stained with blood, he finally understood. The creature hadn't just been waiting for him. It had been waiting for all of them. Suddenly, wicked curved claws slashed through the air where his head had been moments before. Chris dove through the open door of the bus, scrambling toward the back as the creature pursued. In his panic, he caught only glimpses of his attacker. A nightmarish emaciated form with grayish skin pulled taut over protruding bones, unnaturally long limbs ending in razor-sharp claws. But its face, a skull-like visage with sunken black eyes and needle-like teeth, seemed almost familiar. Chris wedged himself into the rear emergency exit of the bus, ready to bolt if the creature got too close. But something made him hesitate. The monster's movements seemed almost purposeful. It wasn't just attacking blindly. It was hurting him, driving him deeper into the bus. For what felt like hours, Chris played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the creature. It would disappear for long stretches, only to suddenly attack from a new angle. During one of these lulls, as the moonlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, Chris heard something that made his heart stop. "Chris, sweetheart, are you in there?" His mother's voice called softly from outside the bus. "Please come out. We've been so worried." It sounded exactly like her, the gentle tone she used when he was scared, the slight catch in her throat when she was concerned. For a split second, Chris almost called out in response, but then he remembered the creature's otherworldly shriek from earlier. How could his mother possibly be there? "She's right, son," his father's voice joined in. "Whatever scared you, we can handle it together, just like we always have." Chris pressed himself further into the shadows at the back of the bus, covering his mouth with his hand to stifle his breathing. The voices were perfect imitations, too perfect. He could hear the familiar way his father's voice grew gruff when he was trying to hide his emotion, the subtle Kansas accent that crept in when he was stressed. "They're not real," Chris whispered to himself. "They're not real. They're not real." Then came the voice that shattered his resolve completely. "Chris? Little brother?" James's voice drifted through the darkness, sounding exactly as it had 3 years ago. "I've been waiting for you. I knew you'd find me eventually." Tears streamed down Chris's face as he listened to his brother's voice. It held all the warmth and protection he remembered, the slight laugh that always seemed to dance at the edges of James' words. "Remember how we used to go camping in the backyard?" James's voice continued, closer now. "Remember the stories we'd tell? I've got so many new stories to share with you, Chris. All you have to do is come outside." Chris's whole body trembled. He wanted so desperately to believe it was real, that his brother had somehow survived all this time. But through his tears, he caught a glimpse of something moving outside the bus windows, a tall, emaciated shape gliding between the trees, its mouth moving wrongly as it produced those achingly familiar voices. "You're not him!" Chris choked out, his voice breaking. "You're not any of them!" The creature's response was a horrifying blend of all 3 voices at once, distorting and overlapping until they became an inhuman shriek of rage. It slammed against the side of the bus, rocking the entire vehicle. Chris could hear its claws screeching against the metal as it searched for a way in. As he pressed himself into the darkest corner of the bus, Chris's hand brushed against something. His heart nearly stopped when he pulled it out. The battered leather journal that looked just like his brother's, its pages warped from exposure to the elements. He'd know it anywhere. It was James's. With trembling fingers, Chris opened to the final entry, dated just 3 days after his brother had disappeared. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, so different from James's usual neat script. "It's not just hunting us. It's collecting us. It learns from each person it takes. Their voices, their memories. Don't listen when it calls, no matter what it sounds like, no matter what it says. Don't listen." The journal slipped from Chris's numb fingers. All this time his brother had been trying to warn him, and now that same creature was out there, wearing his family's voices like a mask, waiting to add him to its collection. The night dragged on endlessly, punctuated by the creature's attacks and long stretches of terrible silence. But as dawn finally began to break, Chris heard new sounds, shouting voices, dogs barking. The creature retreated with an angry shriek, melting into the shadows of the forest. Moments later, flashlight beams cut through the early morning mist. "Hello?" A gruff voice called out. "Anyone alive in there?" Chris's eyes widened. A human voice. He wanted to respond, but fear still gripped him, holding his tongue. "This is Sheriff Harding," the voice continued. "If you can hear me, you're safe now. That thing is gone. You can come on out." Slowly, hesitantly, Chris emerged from the bus. He squinted in the sudden light of multiple flashlight beams pointed his way. As his eyes adjusted, he made out several figures standing around the clearing, men in police uniforms with rifles at the ready. An older man with graying hair and a thick mustache approached cautiously. "Easy there, son," he said gently. "You're all right now. Can you tell me your name?" Chris," he managed to croak out through his dry throat. "Chris Miller." The sheriff's eyes widened in recognition. "The missing kid. Your friend Stephen called your parents. He told them about the dare. He was worried about you. Half the town's been out searching for you since midnight. Your parents are worried sick." As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of Chris's ordeal came crashing down on him. He burst into tears, his whole body shaking with sobs of mingled terror and relief. But clutched tightly in his hand was his brother's journal, proof that he wasn't crazy, that the nightmare was real. Sheriff Harding helped the distraught boy out of the clearing, supporting him as his trembling legs threatened to give way. "Let's get you home, son," he said kindly. "You're safe now." As they made their way out of the woods, flanked by watchful deputies, Chris finally found his voice again. What was that thing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was grim. "Something that doesn't belong in this world," he said. "Something that's haunted these woods for generations. We've never been able to kill it permanently. It always comes back eventually, but we've driven it off for now." Chris shuddered, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. Will it come after me again?" Sheriff Harding squeezed the boy's shoulder reassuringly. "We'll be increasing patrols around the borders of Crooked Oaks. That creature won't set foot in town while I'm sheriff." As they emerged from the tree line, Chris saw flashing lights up ahead, police cars, and an ambulance. His parents stood talking anxiously with a deputy, but when they caught sight of Chris, they rushed forward with cries of relief. Chris fell into their embrace, clinging to them as he sobbed out the whole terrifying tale. Over his mother's shoulder, he saw Sheriff Harding conferring quietly with his deputies, their expressions grave as they examined his brother's journal. In that moment, Chris knew his life would never be the same. The horrors he had witnessed in Crooked Oaks Forest would haunt his dreams for years to come. But he had survived. He was stronger than he had ever imagined, and now he had a purpose: to understand what had happened to his brother and all the others who had vanished in these woods. As his parents fussed over him and paramedics checked him for injuries, Chris found himself glancing back at the dark line of trees. For just an instant, he thought he glimpsed a pair of gleaming yellow eyes watching from the shadows. Then they were gone, leaving him to wonder if it had been real or just a trick of his traumatized mind. But deep in the hidden heart of the forest, something stirred. Claws scraped against bark. Hungry eyes gleamed in the darkness. The creature may have been driven back, but it was far from defeated. It could be patient. It had all the time in the world. And sooner or later, Chris would return to its domain. When that day came, it would be ready. After all, Crooked Oaks Forest had been its collecting ground for centuries, and its collection was still incomplete. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.